Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name is Jennifer. Now, as spring inches ever so slowly closer, I thought it would be a good time to talk about garden planning. Now, I do want to say up front, this is not going to be a comprehensive how-to video, probably honestly not even really a how-to video at all, but I just wanted to take you into my garden and share a little bit of my process and how I plan my garden, and hopefully seeing how I plan my garden will give you just spark some inspiration for people looking for ideas to plan their own gardens as well. So as you can see, here in the winter, my garden has definitely seen better days. It's the off season, so not that much life going on in here right now. So as you can see, I still have a lot of garden cleanup to do from last year. That's a topic for a whole separate video, so try to ignore all the messiness in this garden. We're just going to talk a little bit about my garden planning process today. So when it comes to garden planning, you're going to find a lot of different approaches. Some people really like to have a detailed plan. They like to plan out everything. They know exactly what plants they're going to grow, exactly where they're going to plant them. They have a plan for succession sowing, and they just know once they have their plants, they know exactly where to put them. And then other people kind of fly more by the seat of their pants and don't really have a plan. They just kind of come out to the garden and plant where they feel to plant the plants at that moment. Now, I would say I'm kind of in the middle of that. There are certain things that I plan. You know, I'm working with limited space here in my garden, so I really need to have a plan for a lot of my larger plants, like my tomatoes that take up a lot of space. I like to have an overall plan for my garden, but I like to leave some flexibility too, to kind of put things where I feel like is the best spot for them in the moment. So you can see in my garden, I have a lot of vertical growing supports. I've got these cattle panel arches here. I've also got these welded wire fencing walls, and as I'm looking around my garden, I'm realizing that it's a little messier than I even realized. So I hope that you will excuse that. I haven't gotten to the garden cleaning portion of the season yet. You know, that's another thing where there are multiple approaches. A lot of people clean up their garden as soon as it's done the previous fall. Some people wait till spring when it's time to plant the new garden. I think it's pretty obvious which camp I'm in. I did do a little bit of garden cleanup, but I am leaving the bulk of it to be some of my early spring projects. As I said, I don't want to get too much into that because that's a whole separate video. Let's get back to planning this coming year's garden. So you can see behind me here one of my welded wire fencing supports. I use these primarily to grow tomatoes. I find that they work a lot better to support tomatoes than, you know, those kind of common tomato cages that you see everywhere. We'll talk more about that as the season goes on and we talk about tomatoes. But I have these, I want to say permanently installed. Honestly, they could be moved pretty easily, but I keep these up year round. I have 3 of these fencing supports here. I also have these 3 cattle panel arches in my bed. As you can see, some of them are still covered with the remnants of last year's pole beans. But all of these vertical supports really make up the backbone of my garden, and the plants that are growing on them are going to be plants that are going to take up the majority of space. They're going to be plants that need vertical support, so I only have so many options for where I'm going to grow those plants. What I like to do is to start my garden planning by thinking about the largest plants that I'm going to grow, and also the most important plants to me in my garden, which in both cases is primarily going to be tomato plants. So when I start my garden planning, I usually start with tomatoes. As I said, they're my favorite thing in the garden. They also take up a lot of space. They need vertical support. So I look at these welded wire fences, and I tend to space my tomatoes fairly closely together, so I can put 6 tomato plants using the spacing that I do along each of these walls. Since I have 3 walls there, I know that that gives me 18 tomato plants. So that's what I plan first. I plan my tomato plants, and then I look at this wall here, and I know that 18 tomato plants are going to take up the center of this bed, but there's going to be room on the ground. So you can see if I have 6 tomato plants planted along this wall here, I still have all of this ground space where I can grow something else. So I'll kind of keep that space in the tomato beds kind of in front of and behind the tomatoes along the ground. I'll keep that in mind as I plan the rest of my garden, because I will be able to put plants there, but I just need to make sure that I choose the right kind of plants. We'll come back to that. Now let's talk about a couple of the other larger sort of what I consider main plants in my vegetable garden. One of those would be broccoli. Broccoli tends to not be as large as tomato plants. They don't get nearly as tall, but they do take up pretty similar footprint in the ground. So broccoli is a large plant. Broccoli is going to take a lot of space. It's going to take a lot of nutrients. So we want to give that priority too. So I plan my broccoli to go in a bed like this. The reason I'm choosing this bed for my broccoli is because it's kind of at the back of the vegetable garden. It doesn't get quite as much sun. While broccoli plants do prefer full sun, they're a little bit more tolerant of having a little bit of shade than, say, a tomato or a pepper plant. Something like that, like a tomato or a pepper, really needs full sun. Basically, any plant that you're growing, this is a generalization, but for the most part, plants that you're growing for the fruit are going to want full sun. Broccoli is grown for the bud cluster. So while it does like full sun, it certainly wouldn't thrive if we put it in a partial shade situation. As I said, it's more important for the tomatoes to get full sun than for the broccoli. Now, if you have a huge garden with lots of space, you have full sun everywhere in ideal conditions, you're not going to have to prioritize the same way that I do. I'm working with limited space, and my garden, my entire yard is really lacking in sunshine. We have enough for a garden, but barely. So the tomatoes get priority. The broccoli gets a little bit of a shadier spot, but it generally still does really well for me. So that's the compromise that I've made in my garden. One thing I like to do in my garden, in case you haven't noticed by now, is to save space as much as possible by growing vertically. Now you can see I have these cattle panel arches here, and there are certain plants that need this support. Plants like cucumbers really need that space to climb, so I always plan for my cucumbers to grow on one of these cattle panel arches. Now there are bush varieties of cucumbers that you can grow which don't require something to climb, but I have found in my personal experience that I prefer the climbing varieties. I find that they yield better, they have more varieties that I like, so I just grow the climbing cucumbers and I make sure to give them something to climb. As long as you give them something to climb on, they're not going to take up any more garden space as far as in-ground space than a bush cucumber, and honestly probably a little bit less if they're supported. Similarly, pole beans need to climb. I do grow both pole beans and bush beans, but bush beans don't need to be supported, so I can kind of plug those in my garden here or there. Those are one of those, I don't want to call it an afterthought, but they're one of the plants that doesn't get priority in my overall garden plan because I know that they're small and I can plug them in anywhere I have a space. Pole beans need to climb. So I always make sure that I have some space on my arch trellises reserved for pole beans. So I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. Hopefully it still makes sense and you're still able to follow this video even with my a little bit of, I don't want to say disorganization because I get how it could seem disorganized, but this is honestly how my mind works when it comes to garden planning. So once I have my big plants in place, the ones that I'm going to plant everything else around, then I'm going to think about what space I have between those plants or in other places, and then I'm going to think about where I can put that. So for example, I mentioned bush beans are a great plant to kind of interplant with other plants. Lettuce is another great option for that. A lot of those plants you can kind of plug in wherever you have space. For example, under my broccoli plants last year, I grew what I called a living mulch of lettuce. So I put my broccoli plants in place, and then I sprinkled lettuce seeds in between all the broccoli plants, and that worked really well for me last year. What happened was the lettuce grew. At first the broccoli plants were really small. The lettuce was able to get the sun that it needed to grow. And then as the broccoli plants got larger and as they needed more of that space, it was time to harvest the lettuce and let the broccoli plants have the space. Now, the lettuce also really benefited the broccoli because since it was growing underneath the broccoli, it prevented weeds, it prevented water evaporation, and it just all around, it was a great way to get a little bit extra out of that space. So I may look at my 8x4 raised bed that I'm planning to cram 12 broccoli plants into. 12 broccoli plants will fit in that bed as long as I space them fairly closely. But for the majority of those plants' lives, they're going to be pretty small, and the majority of that bed is going to be empty. So by filling it with something like lettuce, I'm making the most use of that space possible. I'm making sure that while the broccoli is small, all that extra garden space is still getting used, and we also have a bonus. We also have the bonus effect of preventing weeds. So thinking about little things like that is a great way to really get the most out of your garden. I'm going to be doing some more experimenting this year as far as plants that I plant alongside my tomatoes, as far as placement of lettuce and greens and other plants like that. I haven't gotten it all figured out yet, but I will still be kind of following this plan. So usually as garden season actually starts, I have a real basic plan. I know where my tomatoes are going to go. I know where my cucumbers and my pole beans are going to go. My garlic is already planted because we planted that last fall. That's over in the garden extension over in the side yard. And I'll know where my broccoli is going to go. But I won't know where a lot of my other plants are going to go until the last minute. That includes a lot of flowers, companion plants. If you've been following along with me for past years, you know that I love growing flowers in my vegetable garden. I think that they really add something to the joy of gardening. I think that they add so much beauty and they make your garden a place that you want to be, which means that your garden is going to be healthier. But flowers, of course, have a practical benefit too. They attract pollinators, they attract beneficial insects. They're just all around really important to include in a vegetable garden. But I will say my flowers are something that I don't plan. I make a basic plan in the spring as far as flowers that I want to grow. I buy the seeds, and then there are some flowers that I start ahead of time from seed, some that I just direct sow in the ground when the time is right. But flowers are something that I don't really plan. Once I have my vegetables in place, I kind of look around my vegetables. I see where could benefit from having some flowers. Where do I have extra space? Where do I have a plant that's going to need to make sure that pollinators come to it? Something like squash or cucumbers really rely on pollinators to bear fruit. So you want to make sure that you include pollinator attracting plants next to those vegetables. You're also going to want to take into account things like growth habits. So for example, last year I had one bed that was all sweet potatoes. Now if you've ever grown sweet potatoes, you know that they vine out along the ground. They take up a lot of ground space, but they do not get tall. They basically just spread out and become a ground cover. So in my sweet potato bed, I added some cosmos. Now, I put them in when the sweet potatoes were small and you could still see a lot of the ground. So the cosmos grows up and becomes tall. It's really wispy and feathery and spreads out. It makes a great complement to the sweet potatoes, or at least it did in my experience, because the sweet potatoes basically just crawl along the ground. The cosmos are tall, so they don't interfere with each other. If I was trying to grow something in my sweet potatoes that was really low growing, that was maybe a spreading plant, it wouldn't have worked as well because they would have been competing with each other. But by growing the cosmos, something that's tall and airy, it makes a really good contrast to the sweet potatoes and they grow really well together. Kind of along that same lines with my broccoli, I mentioned that last year I did grow a lot of lettuce, kind of as a living mulch along with the broccoli. But another option you could use for a living mulch for broccoli is alyssum. Alyssum is a great garden companion plant. It's low growing and spreading. I use it a lot in my garden on the edges of the beds to kind of cover the bare soil that I don't want exposed. But it's also great to grow in between other plants like broccoli because it will spread out. So alyssum is a great companion plant for the garden. Anytime you want to cover ground, it's also great attracting pollinators and beneficial insects. So just think of the growth habits of the plants that you're growing. Something low and spreading might do well with something tall that doesn't necessarily have a large footprint, but takes up a lot of vertical space. Now I mentioned before that I'll be growing tomatoes on these walls here. And you can see this wall here is sort of in the middle of the bed. So there's going to be ground space here and also on the other side behind the wall where I can grow something else. So once I have the tomatoes in place on this wall behind me, I can look at both sides of the garden bed and decide what to put there. Now, you do want to also take into account the angle of sunlight. With my garden, the sun, for the most part of the day, comes from kind of behind me, which means the spot in front of the tomatoes is going to get plenty of sun. The spot behind the tomatoes is going to be a little bit more shaded. So I'm going to take that into account when I decide what to plant there. So on the front of the garden bed, I'm kind of still deciding exactly how I'm going to do this. I was debating with planting something that's kind of low growing and spreads out, maybe along the lines of squash plants. I have grown zucchini in front of my tomatoes before, and that seemed to work pretty well. I'm not sure what's going on in the trees there. The birds are really excited about something. So I was thinking about growing possibly some squash plants along the ground in that bed. Behind the bed, where it's going to get a little more shade, I was thinking of growing some things. You know, it's going to have to be something that's a little bit more shade tolerant. So I was thinking about some things like lettuce and other salad greens. I mentioned that I'll be growing some of those alongside my broccoli. We like to grow a lot of lettuce and a lot of salad greens in my family. We eat a lot of those in the early summer. And that kind of brings me to another topic that you might want to keep in mind when garden planting, and that is succession planting. Now, some plants, for example, lettuce, has a fairly short maturity date, which means that you can plant it, especially if you're harvesting baby greens. You can plant it and get a harvest fairly quickly. What's going to happen as the summer goes on, your lettuce is going to bolt and turn bitter because it doesn't really like the heat. Now, what I like to do is plan for succession planting, which means that every few weeks I like to plant more lettuce in my garden, making sure that I have a continuous supply of lettuce. You know, there are other plants that have really short maturity dates as well. You can check your seed packet for maturity dates and find some other great candidates for succession sowing. I find that bush beans work really well for that as well. Another thing that I really like to keep in mind when I'm planting my garden and as my garden is growing is that I don't need to get it exactly right the first year. You know, every year that I garden, I have learned more. As long as you pay attention to your garden and as long as you observe your plants, how they grow together, how they grow in certain parts of your garden, just how certain environmental conditions affect those plants, the more that you observe your garden, the more time that you spend in your garden, and honestly, the more notes you take about your garden, the more you're going to learn and be prepared each year. So you'll hear me as the season goes on talk about some experiments that I'm doing in the garden this year. I like to do a lot of experimenting in the garden, and I find that that helps me learn a lot what certain plants like specifically in my area, and also learn a little bit more about my style as a gardener. Because honestly, this, as I said, this is all my approach to garden planting. You may have a completely different approach to me. Honestly, this video may be driving you crazy because if you're one of those people who is really organized and likes to have everything planned out, my kind of haphazard gardening style might be really frustrating to you, and I get that. I do have my tomatoes planned out. I have pared down the tomato varieties that I want to grow from a really long list to a, fairly long list. I'll be starting my tomato plants and then eventually transplanting them out later in the spring. One last thing that I do want to mention that's really important when it comes to garden planning is flexibility. Because honestly, in gardening, there is so much that's not in our control. We can't control the weather conditions. We can't control the temperature. A lot of times we can't even really control the pests what pests are going to be around that year. We can try our best to work around all those factors and give our garden the best shot that we can. As long as you approach your garden plan knowing that the weather may have something else to say about it, and just being prepared to be flexible and kind of roll with the punches and make changes as needed, then honestly, I think that just have fun with it. Gardening shouldn't be stressful. We don't want to overcomplicate it and make it too stressful. If I planned everything completely rigidly, that would be stressful for me. Now, you may be different. If you may say that flying by the seat of your pants is stressful. You may want everything completely planned, so go ahead and do that. That's your gardening style. That's what works for you. I think one of the biggest things with garden planning is just to accept that everyone is going to do it a little bit differently. You will, as you garden and as you get more experience, you will find the method that works best for you. So if you have any tips for garden planning, or if you'd just like to share your overall approach to garden planning in the comments below, I would love to hear from you. I always love to hear from people who have a different approach than I do. I find that it's just interesting to see how everyone works a little bit differently. And honestly, I might pick up some tips from you that I would love to incorporate into my garden planning season as well. So I hope that you're having a great day. I hope that this rambly video was helpful to you in some extent. And I hope that you are really excited about garden planning. I know I am, and I can't wait to get the season started. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you soon. I'll see you next time.